The moment Evelyn Carter stepped out of the glass elevator into the polished marble lobby of Carter Tech, everything seemed exactly as it should be. Controlled, efficient, flawless, until her eyes landed on a man who didn't belong standing near the reception desk in worn jeans and a faded jacket. His hand gripping a small girl's shoulder as if the entire world might pull her away from him if he let go for even a second, and something about the scene immediately triggered alarm. The receptionist looked uneasy. Security had already begun circling, and the man Daniel Brooks was speaking in a low, urgent tone, trying to explain something no one appeared interested in hearing. While the little girl beside him, Lily, clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, her wide eyes darting between unfamiliar faces and her father's tense expression. And when Evelyn approached, heels clicking sharply against the floor, the entire lobby shifted, as if a current of authority had cut through it. Her gaze sharp and unforgiving as she asked a single question: "What's going on here?" To which the receptionist replied, voice tight, "He says he needs access to the building, claims it's urgent." And that was all Evelyn needed to hear, because in her world, urgency from a stranger usually meant risk, and risk was something she eliminated without hesitation. So when Daniel tried to step forward, lifting a small flash drive as if it could justify his presence, she didn't even let him finish as she raised her hand slightly and said, cold and precise, "Call security, and call the police." And just like that, everything escalated. Lily's fingers tightened around her father's sleeve, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Dad." What's happening while Daniel remained still, his jaw tightening, but his eyes strangely calm. Almost as if he had expected this reaction, as if he had walked into it knowingly. And when the first officer entered through the revolving doors, the atmosphere snapped. Completely. Conversations died. Phones lowered and every gaze fixed on the man now being treated like a threat as the officer approached and asked him to step away from the desk to keep his hands visible to explain himself. But Daniel didn't argue, didn't resist. He only knelt slightly to meet his daughter's eyes and murmured something soft and steady that no one else could hear before standing again and looking directly at Evelyn, holding her gaze with a quiet intensity that made something flicker just for a second before she shut it down completely. And then, he said, not loudly, not angrily, but with a certainty that didn't belong to someone in his position, "You're making a mistake." And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the room hesitated, as if the weight of those words had landed somewhere deeper than anyone wanted to admit, before the officer reached for his arm and everything moved forward anyway. The officer's hand closed around Daniel Brooks's arm, firm but not aggressive, guiding him a step away from the reception desk as the quiet hum of Carter Tech's lobby turned into a low murmur of curiosity and judgment. And Daniel didn't resist, didn't even flinch. He simply shifted his weight so Lily wouldn't stumble, his free hand instinctively moving to steady her small shoulder as she clung tighter to him. Her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest like a shield against a world that had suddenly become too loud and too cold. And while the scene looked like a routine removal of an intruder to everyone watching, there was something off about the man's composure, something that didn't match the worn fabric of his jacket or the scuffed edges of his shoes. Because instead of panic or anger, there was only a quiet, controlled awareness in his eyes, as if he were watching a situation unfold that he had already calculated 10 steps ahead, and Evelyn Carter noticed it, even as she crossed her arms, maintaining the rigid posture that had built her empire, her gaze sharp and unwavering. But somewhere beneath that polished exterior, there was the faintest ripple of irritation, not at him, but at the fact that he didn't look afraid. And she despised unpredictability almost as much as she despised inefficiency. So when Daniel spoke again, calmly asking if he could just have a moment to explain, she cut him off with a slight shake of her head, her voice crisp enough to slice through the air. "You've had your moment." And the officer nodded, beginning to lead Daniel toward the glass doors. But Lily suddenly pulled back, her small voice breaking through the tension. "Please. He didn't do anything wrong." And the simplicity of her plea made several employees glance at each other uneasily, though none stepped forward. Because this was Carter Tech, and Carter Tech didn't question Evelyn. Carter, not out loud, not in front of others, not ever. And yet the discomfort lingered subtle but growing, as Daniel knelt again, lowering himself so he was eye level with Lily, his voice soft but steady. "Hey, look at me." And she did, tears trembling at the edge of her lashes. "Remember what I told you? Sometimes people don't understand right away." And she nodded slightly, though her grip on him tightened, and he gave her a faint smile, the kind that held more reassurance than certainty, before standing again and allowing the officer to guide him forward. His posture straight, his movements deliberate. And as they reached the midpoint of the lobby, something else shifted. Something no one could quite name at first. Just a flicker on the massive digital display wall that stretched across the far side of the room, where real-time analytics and system health metrics usually scrolled in perfect synchronized harmony. But now one of the panels stuttered a brief glitch barely noticeable, unless you were paying attention. And most people weren't, not yet, because all eyes were still on the unfolding scene. But one person did notice a junior systems analyst named Jason Miller, who had been standing near the edge of the crowd, his tablet in hand, his brows knitting together as he glanced up at the display again, because Carter Tech's systems didn't glitch. Not like that, not ever. And as he tapped quickly on his screen, pulling up internal diagnostics. Daniel's voice carried faintly across the lobby, directed not at the officer this time, but at no one in particular. "If you let me go, you're going to regret it in about 20 minutes. And the statement hung in the air, absurd on the surface, almost laughable, but there was no desperation in it, no attempt to bargain or threaten, just a simple, measured prediction. And that was what made Evelyn's eyes narrow slightly, though she masked it immediately with a dismissive tilt of her chin. "Remove him," she said, and the officer complied, pushing the door open as a rush of cool city air spilled into the lobby. But before Daniel stepped through, he paused just long enough to look back once more, his gaze sweeping across the room. Not pleading, not defiant, just observant as if he were committing every detail to memory. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. And for a moment the lobby remained suspended in that strange silence that follows an unexpected disruption, until Evelyn turned sharply, her attention snapping back to the business of the day. "Everyone back to work," she said, and like a spell breaking. The employees dispersed conversations, reigniting in hushed tones as people returned to their stations. Though the undercurrent of unease didn't fully dissipate, and Jason was still staring at his tablet, his fingers moving faster now, pulling up logs, cross-referencing timestamps, because that flicker hadn't been random. It had been a signal, a tiny fracture in a system designed to be unbreakable. And as he dug deeper, another anomaly surfaced, then another. Small inconsistencies that by themselves meant nothing, but together began to form a pattern. And his pulse quickened as he realized what he was looking at, because this wasn't a glitch. It was the beginning of something much worse, and across the lobby. Evelyn had just reached the elevator again when her assistant approached, tablet in hand. "Ma'am, there's a minor irregularity in the system metrics," and Evelyn barely paused. "Then, fix it," she replied, stepping into the elevator as the doors slid shut, sealing her inside her controlled, predictable world while outside in the space she had just left. That world was beginning to unravel in ways she couldn't yet see, and Jason, still standing where he had been, felt a chill run down his spine as he whispered to himself almost without realizing it. "Who are you?" Because the more he looked at the data, the more it seemed to respond to a logic he had only ever seen once before, years ago, buried in archived documentation from a system architect whose work had been described in near mythical terms among those who understood it. A name that had surfaced briefly in his mind when he saw the pattern, only to be dismissed as coincidence. But now it returned with growing insistence. Daniel Brooks, and Jason shook his head, trying to ground himself, because that couldn't be right. That man had just been escorted out like a trespasser, like someone who didn't belong. And yet the code unfolding on his screen told a different story, one that didn't fit the narrative everyone else had accepted so easily. and as he took a step forward, his decision forming even before he fully acknowledged it, Lily's small voice echoed faintly in his memory. "He came to help you." And for the first time since the incident began, doubt didn't just flicker at the edges of the room. It took root, quiet but persistent, waiting for the moment it would no longer be ignored. Jason didn't realize he was already moving until he found himself sprinting down the corridor, his tablet clutched tightly in his hand as lines of code and cascading alerts flooded the screen in a pattern that made his chest tighten with a mix of dread and awe, because this wasn't just a system anomaly anymore, it was a coordinated breach. Subtle intelligent. Designed not to trigger alarms until it was far too late, and the only person who had recognized it before it even fully surfaced had just been escorted out of the building like a criminal. And that thought hit him harder than anything else as he reached the executive floor and burst into the boardroom without knocking, interrupting a meeting already in progress where Evelyn Carter stood at the head of the table mid-sentence, her voice sharp and controlled as she addressed a group of investors and senior executives. But every word stopped the moment the doors slammed open and Jason's voice cut through the room, breathless yet urgent. "We have a critical breach," and for a second, no one spoke. The weight of those words settling heavily over polished wood and tailored suits, and Evelyn's eyes narrowed instantly, irritation flashing first before calculation replaced it. "Explain," she said, her tone low but commanding, and Jason stepped forward, pulling up the system feed on the main display, with shaking hands as he began to speak. It started as minor irregularities, but it's escalating someone's inside the architecture, not just accessing data, rewriting it. And murmurs broke out around the table as executives leaned forward, their composed expressions cracking under the implication because Carter Tech's security was considered untouchable, an industry benchmark, a fortress. And yet the evidence unfolding on the screen told a different story entirely, one that grew more alarming with every passing second as red indicators began to spread across the interface like a slow-burning fire, and Evelyn stepped closer. Her gaze locked on the data, her mind already calculating damage containment response. "Who's responsible?" she demanded, and Jason hesitated just for a fraction of a second before answering. "I don't know yet, but the method, the structure, it's based on the original system design." And that was when something shifted in the room, subtle but undeniable, because the original system wasn't just code, it was legacy, something only a handful of people had ever truly understood, and Evelyn's jaw tightened as she turned back to him. "Then get one of those people in here," she snapped, but Jason didn't move, his voice quieter now but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. We already had him, and the silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room snapping toward him as the meaning of his words settled in, and Evelyn's expression hardened. "What are you talking about?" And Jason swallowed, forcing himself to hold her gaze as he said it. "Daniel Brooks. He's not just some random guy. He's the one who built the foundation of this system, and for the first time since the meeting began, Evelyn Carter didn't have an immediate response, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the shock beneath as fragmented memories surfaced, old reports, archived names, decisions made before her tenure, and suddenly the man she had dismissed, the man she had ordered removed without hesitation, no longer fit the image she had assigned to him. And around the table the executives began to react, voices rising in urgency and disbelief. "You're saying we just had the architect of our security system escorted out by the police? Is that even possible? How the hell did no one flag this?" And the tension escalated rapidly. No longer controlled, no longer contained as the implications spiraled outward, because if Daniel Brooks was who Jason believed him to be, then not only had they misjudged him, they had potentially just lost the only person who could stop what was now unfolding in real time, and as if to punctuate that realization, the main display flickered violently. Entire sections of data vanishing before their eyes, replaced by corrupted strings that rendered the system unreadable, and a sharp alarm echoed through the building. No longer a silent breach, but an active crisis, and Evelyn's hand slammed against the table, the sound cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" she said, her voice rising above the noise. But this time, there was something different in it. Not just authority, but urgency. because control was slipping and she could feel it, and she turned back to Jason, her expression now razor-focused. "Find him," she ordered. "Now." And within seconds, the room erupted into motion, assistants scrambling, calls being made, security feeds being pulled up and outside. Somewhere beyond the glass walls and controlled environments of Carter Tech, Daniel Brooks stood on the sidewalk with Lily beside him, the city moving around them in indifferent rhythm as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because inside that building, the system he had once created was collapsing under the weight of something he had warned them about, and he knew it. He had seen it coming long before anyone else, long before anyone would listen, and Lily looked up at him, her small voice quiet but steady. "Are they going to call you back?" And Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting toward the towering structure behind them, its mirrored surface reflecting a distorted version of the world around it. "They will," he said softly, not with arrogance. Not with satisfaction, but with a calm certainty that came from understanding a truth no one else had yet fully grasped. And inside the boardroom, as the system continued to deteriorate and panic edged closer to the surface, Evelyn Carter stood at the center of it all, her earlier decision echoing in her mind with increasing clarity, each second amplifying its consequences until finally, the realization struck with undeniable force. She hadn't just made a mistake, she had misjudged the most important variable in the entire equation. And now everything depended on whether it was already too late to fix it. The black SUV hadn't even come to a full stop before the rear door swung open and Daniel Brooks stepped out with Lily's small hand still wrapped in his, the city noise folding around them, as if the moment itself demanded silence, and across the street the glass facade of Carter Tech reflected a distorted version of their return. A man who had been dismissed minutes ago now walking back toward the building with a calm that didn't belong to someone who had just been humiliated in public, and inside the lobby that had once judged him, stood in a different kind of tension, now quieter, heavier. Every employee acutely aware that something had gone terribly wrong, and that the man they had watched being escorted out might be the only one who could stop it. And when the doors opened, this time no one moved to block him. No one questioned his presence. The security guards stepped aside almost instinctively, their earlier certainty replaced by uncertainty that hung awkwardly in the air. And Lily felt it too. The shift in how people looked at her father, the difference between suspicion and something closer to respect. Though no one had said the word yet, and she tightened her grip on his hand, glancing up at him with a mixture of fear and trust. "It's going to be okay, right?" she whispered. And Daniel looked down at her, his expression softening in a way that no one else in that building had seen. "It will be," he said. And this time, there was a quiet reassurance in his voice that carried more weight than before, because now he wasn't just predicting what would happen, he was walking back into it to fix it. And when the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, the contrast hit even harder. The polished calm of wealth and control now fractured by urgency. Voices overlapping footsteps, quick tension visible in every movement. And the moment Daniel stepped into the boardroom, everything stopped. Conversations cut mid-sentence, eyes turning toward him with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and something dangerously close to guilt. And at the center of it all stood Evelyn Carter. Her posture still straight, still composed, but her eyes no longer held the same certainty as before, because the situation had stripped that away, leaving only the reality of consequences behind. And for a second, neither of them spoke, the weight of their earlier encounter hanging between them like an unspoken accusation, until Evelyn finally broke the silence. Her voice controlled, but lower now, less sharp. Mr. Brooks, and even the way she said his name was different. No longer dismissive, but acknowledging. "We need your help." And Daniel didn't respond immediately, his gaze moving past her to the screens lining the walls, the data streams collapsing, red alerts multiplying. The architecture of the system bending under pressure in a way only someone who truly understood it could see. And he stepped forward slowly, Lily staying close to his side, her small presence in the room, a stark contrast to the high-powered executives surrounding them, and for a brief moment one of the board members leaned toward Evelyn, whispering something about liability, about security protocol, about whether it was appropriate to have a child in the room during a crisis. But Evelyn raised her hand slightly, silencing him, without taking her eyes off Daniel, because whatever rules they had been operating under before no longer applied. And Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady, measured. "You didn't just get breached," he said, his eyes scanning the data. "You're being rewritten." And the words landed like a physical impact, drawing a collective intake of breath from the room. And Jason stepped closer, nodding quickly. He's right. The code isn't just being accessed. It's being altered at the structural level. And Daniel moved to the central console, his fingers hovering over the interface for just a second before he began navigating it with a familiarity that erased any remaining doubt about who he was. Commands flowing rapidly, adjustments precise as if he were stepping back into a language he had never truly left, and Lily watched him from just behind his shoulder, her fear slowly giving way to something else, something closer to awe. Because the man she knew as her quiet, hard-working father was now moving through this high-tech environment like he belonged there more than anyone else. And she felt a small, proud smile begin to replace the tension in her chest. And as Daniel worked, the room began to shift around him, executives who had once dismissed him now leaning forward, watching every move. Their earlier confidence replaced by dependence, and Evelyn stood slightly apart, observing not just the system, but the man himself, the way he operated under pressure, the calm precision, the absence of ego, and it forced her to confront something uncomfortable, something she rarely allowed herself to feel, doubt in her own judgment. And as the minutes passed, Daniel's voice cut through the room again. "This wasn't random," he said, not looking up. "Whoever did this knew exactly where to hit. They've been inside your system for a long time." And another wave of tension rippled outward, because that meant the problem wasn't just external, it was internal, systemic, possibly even intentional. And one of the executives spoke up, his voice tight. "Can you stop it?" And Daniel paused for just a fraction of a second before answering. "I can slow it down," he said. "But if you want to fix it completely, we need to isolate the source." And that was when Lily's voice, small but clear, broke through the heavy atmosphere. "Dad," she said, and every head in the room turned toward her instinctively, not because she held authority, but because in a space filled with tension, her voice carried something else, something grounding, and Daniel glanced back at her, his expression softening again. "What is it?" And she hesitated, looking around at the unfamiliar faces before focusing back on him. "You said sometimes people don't understand right away," she said quietly, "but you still help them anyway." And the simplicity of her words cut through the complexity of the situation with surprising force, because in that moment, it wasn't about systems or breaches or corporate losses. It was about something much more human. And Daniel held her gaze for a second longer before nodding slightly. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's what I said." And when he turned back to the console, there was a subtle shift in the room, a quiet realization that whatever he was doing here, it wasn't driven by ego or revenge, but by something far more grounded. And that realization changed how they saw him, not as a threat, not even just as an expert, but as someone operating on a level they hadn't expected, and as the system began to stabilize in small increments under his control, the red alerts slowing the data streams regaining structure. The tension in the room shifted from panic to fragile hope. But Daniel's expression didn't change because he knew they weren't done yet. And as his fingers moved across the interface, isolating patterns, tracing pathways, he finally said the words that would shift the situation again. "I found it," and the room leaned in collectively. "The entry point. It's coming from inside your executive network. And the implication hung heavy because that meant someone with access, someone trusted someone in that very room or close to it, had either allowed this to happen or been the cause of it. And the silence that followed was different from before, no longer just tense, but charged with suspicion, and Evelyn's gaze hardened. Not toward Daniel this time, but toward the reality he had just uncovered. And for the first time since the crisis began, the balance of power in the room had fully shifted. Not because Daniel demanded it, but because the truth he carried had made it unavoidable. And as Lily stepped a little closer to him, her small hand resting lightly against his arm, she looked around the room once more. Her fear now replaced by something steadier, something stronger, because in her eyes her father had never been anything less than who he was in that moment. And now finally everyone else was beginning to see it too. The room remained still long after Daniel's final command executed the last line of corrupted code isolated and neutralized, as the system screens slowly shifted from warning red back to stable blue, the quiet hum of Carter Tech returning like a distant heartbeat that had nearly stopped but somehow found its rhythm again. And no one spoke at first, because what had just happened was more than a technical recovery. It was a complete reversal of everything they thought they understood. And at the center of it stood Daniel Brooks, no longer invisible, no longer misjudged, but undeniably essential, though he carried none of the pride that room expected. Only a quiet exhale as he stepped back from the console and glanced down at Lily, who looked up at him with a small, relieved smile. Her fingers still gently wrapped around his sleeve as if she had anchored him there just as much as he had protected her. And that small human moment contrasted so sharply with the scale of what he had just prevented that it shifted something deeper in the room. Something that no executive summary or quarterly report could ever capture, and Evelyn Carter felt it more than anyone standing just a few steps away. Her posture still composed, but her certainty completely dismantled, because for the first time in a very long time she had to face the reality that she had been wrong not just in action, but in judgment, in assumption. In the way she had chosen speed over understanding, and as Daniel turned to leave as if the entire crisis had been nothing more than something he had come to fix and move past. She finally stepped forward, her voice quieter now, stripped of its usual sharpness. Daniel and he paused, not immediately turning as if giving her the space to decide what she needed to say, and when he did face her. There was no resentment in his expression, no accusation, only a calm attentiveness that made her words feel heavier than she expected. And for a brief second, Evelyn Carter, the woman who had built an empire on decisiveness and control, hesitated because apologies were not part of her language, not in public, not in front of a room like this. But Lily shifted slightly beside Daniel, her presence small yet undeniable, and something about that made Evelyn take a breath and say it anyway. "I made a mistake." The words simple, but weighted with everything that had come before, and the room seemed to hold that moment, carefully aware that it mattered more than any contract or deal ever signed within those walls. And Daniel gave a slight nod, not dismissing it, not emphasizing it, simply accepting it for what it was. "It happens," he said quietly, and there was no bitterness in it, only truth. And Evelyn studied him for a moment longer before adding, "You should be here." Her gaze steady now, not as a visitor, but as someone leading this. And it was an offer that would have changed most lives in that room instantly. A position, power, recognition, everything that validated worth in their world. But Daniel didn't look at the executives, didn't look at the screens or the building that had just nearly collapsed without him. He looked down at Lily, who met his gaze with a quiet understanding that needed no words, and then he shook his head gently. "I already have something more important," he said. And Lily's small smile widened just enough to say everything that needed to be said. And for the first time, Evelyn didn't push back, didn't negotiate, because she understood, maybe not completely, but enough. And as Daniel took Lily's hand and began walking toward the door, the same path he had been forced down earlier now felt entirely different. The eyes following him no longer filled with suspicion, but with respect, even a quiet gratitude that no one voiced aloud, but everyone felt. And when the elevator doors closed behind them, the room remained silent for a moment longer, not out of tension this time, but reflection. and Evelyn turned slowly back toward the glass wall overlooking the city, watching as the world moved on outside without any awareness of how close things had come to breaking, and she realized something that no data report could ever teach her. That power without understanding was fragile, that speed without listening was dangerous, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room was the one you almost ignored and far below. Daniel and Lily stepped out into the sunlight, the noise of the city wrapping around them again, ordinary, steady, alive, and Lily squeezed his hand lightly as she looked up at him. "They understand now," she said, and Daniel smiled a small, genuine expression that carried both relief and quiet pride. "Maybe," he replied, glancing back once at the towering building behind them before turning forward again. "But what matters is that you always do." And together they walked on, leaving behind a place that had nearly broken under its own certainty, and carrying with them something far stronger than recognition, the simple, unshakable truth of who they were.